New York City in the mid-20th century.
They called him the Godfather of Harlem, a man who fed the poor, feared no police, and ruled the streets like a king. But what if I told you that almost everything you believe about Bumpy Johnson is a lie? What if the man you saw in the movies, the chess-playing hero protecting his people from the mob, was a carefully crafted ghost designed to hide a much darker reality? We've been fed a Hollywood script for decades, a legend polished by cinema to make us root for a ghost. But ghosts don't bleed, and they don't tell the truth. If you think you know the legend of 116th Street, prepare to lose it, because behind the myth of the Black Robin Hood is a story of fear, compromise, and a man who spent more time behind bars than he did on his throne. Stop the scroll. It's time to exhume the truth about the ghost of Harlem. The legend tells us Bumpy was the saint of the sidewalks, a man who handed out turkeys at Thanksgiving and paid the rent for widows when the marshals came knocking. It's a beautiful image, the outlaw as the community's shield. But look closer at the math of the streets. Those turkeys weren't bought with kindness. They were bought with the life savings of the same neighbors who played his illegal numbers rackets every morning. In Harlem's underworld, charity wasn't an act of the heart. It was a strategic street tax. Every grocery bag handed out was a calculated investment in silence. By feeding the hungry, Bumpy wasn't just being a neighbor. He was building a human fortress. When the feds came knocking, the people didn't see a criminal. They saw the man who put bread on their table, and they kept their mouths shut. It was control disguised as compassion. He didn't just rule through fear. He ruled by making the community complicit in his survival. He wasn't Harlem's Robin Hood. He was its landlord, and the rent was paid in loyalty and blood. In the neon-soaked theater of our imagination, Bumpy Johnson stands alone at the top of the mountain, a sovereign king who bowed to no one. We love the image of the defiant rebel holding the Italian Mafia at bay with a shotgun and a glare. But the cold reality of the 1930s and 40s was far less cinematic. The truth is, no one ruled a square inch of New York without the nod from the five families. While the movies portray Bumpy as an equal or a conqueror, history reveals a man who was a master of the middle ground. He didn't break Italian monopoly. He negotiated his way into a seat at their table. Behind the scenes, he was a high-level associate of the Genovese crime family, specifically operating under the shadow of Fat Tony Salerno. His throne was actually a franchise. He was allowed to run the numbers and the streets of Harlem because he was efficient and because he ensured the kickbacks flowed downtown. Power in the underworld doesn't always mean absolute control. Sometimes it just means you've been granted the most prestigious permission to serve. Bumpy wasn't the emperor. He was the governor of a colony. The silver screen paints a picture of a brotherhood forged in the fires of revolution, a criminal kingpin, and a radical minister standing shoulder to shoulder against a common enemy. It's a compelling narrative. The muscle and the mind, the street and the pulpit. But the bond between Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X was far more transactional than sentimental. While it is true they shared a mutual respect born from the harsh pavement of Harlem, the idea of Bumpy as Malcolm's ideological bodyguard is largely a romantic invention. Their worlds were separated by a chasm of purpose. Malcolm was seeking to liberate the souls of Black America, while Bumpy's business relied on the very vices that kept those souls in chains. History suggests that while Bumpy offered protection during Malcolm's split from the Nation of Islam, the minister eventually realized that a movement built on dignity could not be shielded by a man built on racketeering. Malcolm eventually walked away from that protection, choosing a path of martyrdom over the shadow of the underworld. In the end, respect does not equal friendship, and a shared neighborhood does not mean a shared destiny. They weren't allies in a revolution. They were just two powerful men navigating the same storm from different ships. We are conditioned to believe that the truly elite gangsters are ghosts in the system. Men who outsmart every wiretap and slip through the fingers of every Fed. The myth of Bumpy Johnson portrays him as the untouchable chess master, always 3 moves ahead of the badge. But the cold, iron bars of history tell a much lonelier story. If Bumpy was truly smarter than the law, he wouldn't have spent nearly half of his adult life in a cage. The system didn't just touch Bumpy, it swallowed him whole. The peak of this untouchable illusion shattered when he was sent to Alcatraz, the Rock. For over a decade, the King of Harlem was reduced to a number. Isolated by the freezing fog of the San Francisco Bay, thousands of miles from the streets he claimed to rule. There were no silk suits or street-side tributes there, only the rhythmic crashing of waves and the crushing weight of lost time. He wasn't a phantom escaping the net. He was a frequent resident of the federal penal system. In the end, the law didn't need to be faster or smarter. It just needed to be patient. Bumpy Johnson didn't beat the system. He just paid his debt in the most expensive currency a man has: his life, 1 decade at a time. In the final act of a gangster's life, we expect the roar of a Tommy gun or the dramatic betrayal of a protégé. We want the cinematic climax, the slow-motion fall in a rain of glass and brass. But history rarely follows a Hollywood storyboard. The myth of Bumpy Johnson demands a violent end, a warrior's death for a man who lived by the blade. The reality, however, was far more human and hauntingly quiet. In July 1968, the man who had survived the bloody turf wars of the 30s and the cold isolation of Alcatraz met his end not in a dark alley, but at a table in Wells' restaurant. There were no assassins, no dramatic last words, and no hail of bullets. Bumpy was simply a 62-year-old man having a late-night meal of fried chicken and hominy grits. As he reached for the coffee, his heart, strained by decades of adrenaline, prison, and the heavy burden of his own legend, simply stopped. He slumped over into the arms of a confidant, slipping away in the middle of a sentence. It was a loud life that ended in a whisper. The Godfather didn't die a king, he died a customer, proving that time is the one enemy no amount of power can ever outrun. Why do we cling so tightly to the version of Bumpy Johnson that wears a halo of neon and silk? We choose the legend over the ledger because the truth is far less comfortable to digest. Society has always had a hunger for the criminal with a heart of gold, the outlaw who breaks the law to uphold a higher justice. We need to believe in this figure because it offers a sense of order in a world that feels rigged. If a man like Bumpy is a hero, then the chaos of the streets becomes a crusade, and the violence becomes a necessity rather than a business model. Hollywood understands this hunger. It polishes the rough edges of history, turning a drug-running racketeer into a philosopher king, because the real story doesn't sell tickets. The real story, one of addiction, compromised morals, and systemic cycles of poverty, is a tragedy we'd rather not face. We project our own desires for power and protection onto these figures, creating a secular mythology where the bad guy is actually the good bad guy. By keeping the Hollywood filter on, we don't have to confront the uncomfortable reality that sometimes the people we look up to are the ones holding the neighborhood back. We don't want the man, we want the mask. To truly understand the legacy of Bumpy Johnson, we have to look past the sharp suits and the charismatic smile to the faces of the people left in his wake. Every Robin Hood gesture has a hidden cost, and for Harlem, that cost was measured in the slow erosion of its own community. While the myths celebrate his defiance of the mob, they often ignore the products he allowed to flow through the veins of his neighborhood. The numbers racket wasn't just a harmless game of chance, it was a vacuum that sucked the meager savings out of kitchens where every penny was needed for survival. Even darker was the shadow of the heroin trade. While Bumpy famously claimed to keep the poison out, the reality of his alliances meant that the streets he protected were the same ones where addiction took root, tearing families apart and orphaning a generation. The hero image is a luxury enjoyed by those who didn't have to live with the consequences of his business. When we romanticize the boss, we silence the victims, the mothers who lost sons to the needle and the fathers who gambled away the rent. The reality of the streets wasn't a movie. It was a struggle for breath in a grip that Bumpy helped tighten. When we strip away the cinematic glare and the echoes of street corner legends, we are left with a man who was neither the devil nor the saint history wants him to be. Bumpy Johnson was a master of survival in a world designed to ensure his failure. But his survival was a high-interest loan that Harlem is still paying back. We celebrate the power, but we rarely tally the invoice. We remember the name, but we forget the silence of the 10,000 days he spent behind stone walls, and the quiet, lonely table where his heart finally gave out. The story of the Godfather of Harlem isn't a blueprint for greatness. It's a cautionary tale about the weight of a crown made of lead. His life proves that you can rule the streets and still be a prisoner to them. In the end, the myth-making serves us more than it ever served him. It lets us look at the tragedy of the underworld and call it a triumph. But as the sun sets over 116th Street, the truth remains. Power is an illusion that demands everything and promises nothing. Maybe the greatest myth of all is believing power ever comes without a price. So, which Bumpy Johnson myth shocked you the most? Was it the charity that was actually a tax? Or the fact that the King of Harlem died over a plate of chicken instead of a hail of bullets? The truth isn't always as pretty as a Hollywood script, but it's the only thing worth remembering. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know if this changed how you see the legend. And if you're tired of the fairy tales and want the real unfiltered stories behind America's underworld, hit that subscribe button. We're just getting started. See you in the next one.